Going.
Cool.
So,
good to see you.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming over. So this is just for the benefit of everyone who has seen the previous live streams with me talking to camera. This is hopefully the start of a new series of live streams and recordings where we're going to interview people that I find most interesting among the folks I come across.
Well, I hope you find some interesting folks.
Well, we'll start off with about as interesting as it gets. So for those of you who don't know, Joseph, I'll let you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, so I'm Joseph Owens. I am a neuroscientist at Google X, which is now actually just called X. It's the R&D factory for Alphabet, which is the parent company for Google. I am a neuroscientist and a management consultant by training, by way of McKinsey and Northwestern. And right now I'm on a team that's called what we call the early pipeline, and we're looking for sort of big ideas that would eventually be companies that would rival Google, basically. So for Alphabet, we are de-risking sort of the bet on Google by creating other bets. Before that, I was a consultant at Google, actually, in the ad side. And then way back when I mentioned my PhD was in neuroscience of sleep. So back when I was a consultant, I was one of the experts on why the job was not very good for you.
And just for everyone who knows my background, Joe and I got over the McKinsey thing quite quickly. So we've settled that sort of conversation. One of the things that was most interesting actually in the conversation was really, one of the things that pharmaceuticals struggle with is this is scaling innovation. And I know that you've had thoughts on that before you joined Google, and clearly since you joined Google. It'd be interesting to hear, whether you think Pharma is going the wrong way in terms of its approach, or do you think that there's a different approach possible?
Well, I don't know if I can speak so well towards what Pharma is doing specifically, but I can speak towards some of the things that happen at Google that are good and some of the things that I think we're improving. One of the things that Google was blessed with was, and I think it was really funny because we both knew this analogy, which was it was a windless tree. And so it had so much revenue for quite a long time that it made sense to plant as many flowers as you could, right? And so by spreading bets as widely and sometimes even duplicatively, you have the opportunity to let things bloom and let things figure out. As you have businesses that are sort of more related to each other, a great example is like DoubleClick, which is programmatic advertising. The pipes for that are so complex. Having 3 different versions of that doesn't really work, right?
Right.
And in some cases we've made smart acquisitions. DoubleClick was actually an acquisition, and in others we've built our own from like the ground up.
Yeah.
I think for innovation to be learned from Google, I would say it's knowing when to pull. It's giving the engineering directors, right? So Google is an engineering-led company.
Okay.
It's giving the equivalent in pharma would be like the scientists or the people kind of closest to it some leeway to make a call on whether they're going to let their directs just sort of experiment.
Yeah.
From what I do know from you and others from pharma, that experimentation is probably not, that degree of experimentation is probably radically different.
Yeah.
And it is software, so you have to remember some of that experimentation is a little bit cheaper from an opportunity cost point of view. But Google engineers are pretty well paid, so.
Right. No, well, and then for those, that metaphor of the windless tree, I think I wrote something about that 2 or 3 years ago, which is based on that observation in the kind of biome or biosphere or whatever the name was.
Yeah, back in the Mojave Desert.
The trees grow to a certain height without wind, but they fall over quickly because they need the stress of the wind to grow. And I think that was that was an appropriate metaphor for companies actually in pharma that are doing very well, despite much pressure from anywhere else. They haven't really need to think about that innovation thing. But I wonder whether in pharma we spend too much time, we make it a quick call on, right, well, we've done the science already, now let's just go to market with this thing. We stop experimenting at that point, so I wonder whether that's kind of a lesson to be learned.
So Google has made a lot of changes around how it proceeds to launch. And specifically how it measures that. Because of its size, it's pretty hard just statistically to figure out whether something's successful because of it's got the Google brand with it. So it's like, what is the adjustment factor for Google launch this?
Yeah.
And I think that's been something teams have been figuring out, how to actually sort of reweight the metrics to see whether this would have sort of been a success on its own.
Okay.
And there's some interesting programs in Google right now. There's a program where they're actually encouraging sort of entrepreneurship within Google. So people have great ideas and they might want to leave.
Right.
They're allowing them to sort of form their own teams and start up and pitch them to sort of an internal sort of VC-like group.
Yeah.
Not necessarily with like upside for the individual, except for just being able to pursue the sort of thing that they see is really important. And so it's a way to catch some of those, folks that like might otherwise leave and start other things. Because everybody has that entrepreneurial spirit.
Well, we spoke about that a little bit. So it'd be good to recover that. Was one of the things that I've thought about over time. You look at something like South San Francisco with a lot of people who've left Genentech because they had to go and pursue their other interests. Interesting that you mentioned that there's no actual incentive for folks internally other than the kind of progression of their careers, or
I think it's interesting if you look at I think it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever. Once you're sort of paid at a decent rate, the monetary incentive, and you're comfortable, if you're engaged with your work and you feel like it's doing something worthwhile, I think the monetary upside can be a bit overvalued in that scenario for a lot of the people I've seen. Like, so there's great engineers who are sort of have families and are comfortable and would be great on startups, but they're not going to go do that. And so I think it actually taps into a sort of, maybe it's a slightly different slice of who would do that, but they're willing to do it because they can keep sort of their Google job.
Nice.
And go for it. There's other people who want to strike it rich, go West Young Man. That sort of.
But that spirit of innovation is encouraged within people that join Google.
Oh yeah, definitely. So Google still has, and I'm a product of this, the 20% program. So I was a strategy consultant in ads. I came into Google. I wanted to learn the main core business, how ads work. It's a lot more complicated than you think it is in the back end.
It's become a big issue recently. Right?
Google touches a lot of surfaces that you might not be aware of. And like how ads get populated across all of these different elements of the internet. How they're sold, how they're traded in real time, all of these things. And like we talked about with the Windless Tree, they hire a lot of consultants, specifically from McKinsey, to come in and help them make those calls. While I was doing that, using my core McKinsey skill set, I started a 20% project. And so for those that want to and have the inclination, it's alive and well. And we formed a team. We were running for 6 months or so. We had engineers, business people, marketers, sort of for our own little thing, and pitched it to all sorts of people. And that's actually what landed me at X.
Right.
And so we had that drive because we saw an opportunity that Google should be working on this thing. And I can't talk about the thing, but we said we want to make sure that Google, or Alphabet actually, is working on this thing, and we pushed it until they sort of took recognition of it.
But you were, and so just maybe walk through the basics of, so the culture that enabled you to put together a bunch of people to at least pitch it to someone else. What's that look like?
So, first off, to do a 20% project, you need to be like doing well in your role, right? But then the idea is you can't. It's based on sort of good psychology, which is you can't focus on one problem all the time, and sometimes switching over to a different problem actually helps you, and you can pull things over from that. And maybe you're going through a lull where it's just, you're bored with sort of the implementation of your project and you're waiting for that next interesting part of your project, but you're still the right person to do that thing. Use some of that spare sort of mental energy, connecting energy, whatever it is, on that 20% piece. And instead of it being seen as sort of like lost time away from core work, it's more of an acknowledgement that you can only do core work really, really very, very well for 4 to 5 hours a day, right? The idea that we can do more than that is kind of, at least my background in psychology, right? Like you can't, right? You check your email, check the stocks, you check the news, you go have coffee, right? And then you look at your time across the day and whatever. But if you had something that was really driving you on the side, and you can keep up that momentum. The other thing is momentum, right? You're keeping up the momentum on that with the one thing, and it carries over to the first. And
So the 20% time isn't like Friday.
No,
it's spread across the
spread
week.
across. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be effective if it was sort of like everybody takes it one day and puts on a different hat. There might be teams that do that. I mean, I've also, the other 20% thing I've done in my time is I teach a mindfulness course.
Okay.
And that's actually a 2.5-day course called Search Inside Yourself. And there's an org that runs that, a non-for-profit that now runs that. And we teach it to Googlers. And so, once a quarter I go and do that. And so that sort of is a different day away. Now that I turned my 20% job into my full-time job, I have a different 20% job.
So people internally, they have the permission to spend that 20%
I think,
time.
you need to be doing
for each other?
Oh yeah, so there's so many ways in which people find people. So the way I just happened to be really crazy interested in this one topic, and someone introduced me to somebody else who was interested in that, and then found one more person, and then it kind of steamrolled from there. And we said, Google has to be doing this, and we just pushed it.
Yeah, and you mentioned X as a special place. What's the special source about X that's different from Google itself?
So X is, let me think about what I can say about X. So X is meant to build new companies. So there's a triumvirate of criteria. One is that it would be affect basically enough people. So we think of 1 billion basically people, which means it needs to not be U.S., just U.S. Right? So it's sort of like it can't be just a U.S. business,
basic
right?
Rule of thumb.
Basic rule of thumb, and it needs to be some sort of radical advancement of technology that has some really breakthrough way of solving a problem. And so that's sort of the 3 criteria, and we put X marks the spot in the middle, and it's always in the eye of the beholder, obviously, how breakthrough something is, or whether. But it has to be for good, and it has to be a self-sustaining business. So it's not a philanthropy.
So the really interesting thing, interesting to come back to the business side, is that those rules of thumb are not market kind of size, right? They're about the problem, the reach, and the benefit. That's those are interesting rules of thumb.
Yeah, and we all of the things that happen at X will touch regulation because they're breakthrough enough, but these aren't sort of business model plays. They aren't regulatory plays. We have a rule. You can't break the laws of physics, but you might, for a little while, break the laws of man, maybe. Right. At least as they currently exist. So, for example, we have a project that literally launched drones into the air called Wing in New Zealand, and because the laws of man there were a little more friendly towards flying things, that was a good place to literally launch. And so you have to figure those things out, right? Same thing with Waymo, which was sort of the initial project at X, which was driverless cars, figuring out how to get those safely on the road and get enough miles driven to train the AI, obviously had regulatory elements. Yeah, and
someone was telling me actually yesterday about the internal betting that happens at Google. So internally, are you able to kind of, is there a market internally on which projects are going to succeed and which ones aren't?
I don't know of one.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know of one, but I've only been there for 3 years. So I've been at Alphabet for 3 years, about a year and a little at Google, and a year and a little at.
Because they were discussing. I mean, again, someone from Pharma had heard this and felt this is an interesting way to see which projects are likely to succeed and which ones aren't, because internally there's a culture of. You know stuff internally that maybe the senior management don't know about.
I would be interested in that. I think people. There's a company called Steam that they do video for gaming. Do you know this? So it's a very engineering-led company, it's much smaller than Google, and they make. I think what they do are sort of a platform for online games, but then they also, I think, serve video. I could get that wrong, but an engineer friend of mine told me that they vote with their feet. And so their desks are sort of attached to their chairs, and people just move their desks together to work together.
Oh, really?
On whatever the project is, and so that I like that that model of you can sort of see what's working and what isn't based on where people are moving. But the betting on things. We have sort of a different version of that at X, which is before we kick off and get really running at speed on a project or even an idea in the early pipeline, we create kill criteria. And so these kill criteria are, what would be a convincing reasons to stop working on this,
Okay.
Because our most valuable thing is our time.
Yeah.
And those are easier to make before you spend a lot of time on the project, because you're not as invested, you haven't hired as many people,
Right,
all of these things. And you try to make them as objective as possible, and the way we sort of do it is we just, we sense test with other people, right? So like, is this significantly better, right, than what exists, or will this outcompete, sort of the current thing on the market? And that allows you, as you get farther down, if you realize you're not meeting that, and you choose when you're going to check in with your criteria beforehand. So it's sort of like good statistics. It's a priori bet, right?
Yeah.
And that allows, for a more objective decision later on down the road.
Yeah.
So in a way, that's sort of it's a way to manage your bets, I guess.
Yeah. And then one of the other things I was really keen to hear you kind of recover was you mentioned the Thank God It's Thursday kind of meetings. And I described to you this kind of environment we're in Pharma, that we spent so much time moving towards this kind of 6-monthly review with senior management of very polished, very carefully curated slides that they're allowed to see. Can you describe a little bit more about this?
Yeah,
this
so
meeting?
Speaking completely for myself, and I think it's well known that this exists out in the world, but the company is, Stephen Levitt, I think, wrote about, the guy from Freakonomics wrote about this in the early days of Google. Larry and Sergey and others of the founding team decided to have a meeting every Thursday with the company. And I think the first meetings were around a ping pong table, which was also like their boardroom meeting, And that tradition has carried on. That was on Fridays. As the company grew to have enough Asia and EMEA components, they moved Thank God It's Friday to Thursday.
Yeah.
And crazily enough, Larry, Sergey, now Sundar, Susan Wojcicki, all these folks get up there and talk about the state of the company weekly.
Every week, yeah.
Weekly.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because, Sergey also does a lot of things at X, and so he's often out of breath from making it the 1 mile and a half from X to doing the same thing at X, going over to main campus. And I think I said this to you, that's really good, but if you're like a product manager and your product's coming up this week, you're going up in front of the CEO and the chairman of the board and whatever, and they'll tell you what they think.
Yeah.
And that's I think that level of transparency is something Google obviously struggled with this last year because of the leaks.
Right.
And I won't kind of talk about that, but the maintaining that transparency, it's amazing. I came into the company my first day, and they give you your computer, and you're like on the intranets, and you're like, I can see this. I shouldn't, in any other company I wouldn't be allowed to see that.
Yeah.
And that trust in a first day Googler, well, maybe I'd go look at that, I'm like, wow, it could be, in my last business we were doing that a different way. Mm-hmm. Maybe I should let that person know. And I often do. Mm-hmm. When I get launch notices from people and they haven't from PMs, and they go out to all of Google, and I see something that I'm like, I have a point of view on, I'll let them know.
Okay.
I'll just reply to that launch notice, not to everyone, but to the PM, and say, hey, I noticed that you guys did something here. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people that do that, and it's not like a trolling sort of way. It's like, there's something I really care about, and maybe you should know about it. And they might ignore you, they might not.
But they might have coffee.
But sometimes you get really long responses, and like, oh, I'm so glad you pointed out that. I was really struggling with how to weight that decision.
Of course.
And I'd love to know, have coffee, whatever, exactly.
So that and that was what struck me about that idea of Larry and Sergey and
it's crazy.
Well, their comfort to do it, and their their appetite to do it as well, because and I think we spoke about the Ed Catmull book about the beginnings of Pixar and plussing, and the way that because plussing sounds nice and gentle, but sounds like there it's also not, that you do get your animations ripped apart by everyone that matters in Pixar, but that's not a destructive thing, but it's a constructive, enabling, empowering way to
as an employee you can get an answer. Right? If there's an issue that you believe is important enough, you can stand up at the mic and ask the heads of the company. And from the beginning. And you might face social feedback on that, right? Your manager. I mean, I've never heard of anything of someone's manager getting mad at them for saying something like that, right? Like, I think I would have heard that if I did, if like there would be, that would sort of, someone would tell you like, hey, don't get up to the mic. But yeah, and then they take internet questions from basically around the company, and then they take mic questions and they alternate.
Okay. No, I mean it's fun because since we spoke about that, I've spoken to a few people in pharma about whether they could imagine a pharma CEO standing there every month, every week.
It goes with the overall culture of transparency, though, right? So if they
is it just transparency, or is there something about the connection to the product, or the kind of ideas, or the?
Yeah, I mean, I think you gotta be willing to go both ways. You have to defend your project. The people getting up there and talking about whatever they're launching or whatever or the bad news cycle on their project, whatever it is. That's one side of it, but then them asking like, hey, we did this launch and the thing that was in the way might have been you, right? Like, and can you tell the audience why you made that decision? No, I don't know if I would go up there and do that, but the audience will. They'll say like, why did you make that decision?
Right. Okay. I mean, it's interesting. I think because part of that same conversation that we had around whether they could imagine pharma CEOs doing that. People tend to go to the ones who they've worked for that they could imagine doing that. And actually, at the same time, those people also seem to be the most empowering and best leaders that people have talked about within pharma. People like, say, Art Levinson at Genentech had that profile of approachability, but also deep. You follow them anywhere with the science. So I wonder whether that was.
Well, you have to remember that Larry and Sergey were grad students at Stanford in information sciences, right? So the transparency piece is there. The depth of engagement is there. Like, these are sort of academics made in, future academics made into CEOs, right? Yeah. And I think Larry's written about this bunch, right? Yeah. About what that transition was like for him. Yeah. And what they're gifted with is all these great people who can teach them these things, right? And so as they were going through, I think, I've seen this written in a number of books about Google. One of the things I did before I applied to Google is I read all the books about Google.
Sort of transparent.
At least the ones that are available, and I can talk about that at a different time. But gleaning from that, so when I was at McKinsey, what I did was a lot of reorgs, and so I worked on helping organizations be more effective because I liked the sort of novelty of that project that problem every time, and reading about their early history and seeing the problems they faced in changing their worldview. I mean, I was a PhD student. That is not an environment that prepares you to be an executive, right? And so the attitude there is you have journal club. And I gotta say, TGIF is not that dissimilar from Journal Club. Journal Club, you get up, you talk about some data, you beat it up. Yeah. The goal is everybody gives their opinion, and if someone's silent, then you're losing out on something useful, because all the researchers in the room are going to have different takes on that data. Maybe they know statistics or genetics or whatever it is. Yeah. It's not that dissimilar. It's bringing a little bit of that academic culture into corporate, I think. Yeah. No,
it's odd. There is something about pharma which I think we could change. Which when we've done what we call pre-mortems with people with project teams to say, well, what are all the things that could go wrong here? Remarkably, it's the first time they've ever been asked, typically, and then they have this long list of things that could go wrong. They're not just about the product, succeeding or failing on its basic parameters, but everything else that needs to be thought about to get it there. And well, if they're not being asked, those things will still happen, and we're just going to ignore it until they do. Is there something that's enabled that? Maybe you described it perfectly, just from the beginning, and always was that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not working on this is, loads of books say this, right? If you're not working on your culture at the beginning, then you're going to have whatever culture you get, right? Changing it, though, is that what you're asking about?
Well, I was wondering, because one of the approaches that you have clearly is that you start other cultures that are separate, right? That you've created companies within Google that are different.
That was one of the things that kept me awake the most when I was working on the 20% project. I said, okay, we've got 5 people on this. Whatever we do right now, that's the beginning of this little proto company's culture.
Yeah.
You know, and those are big weighty problems to think about, right? So how are you making decisions as a group? How are you handling, you know, choosing the direction, right? Are you going to be monolithic based on the one engineer, or are you going to be, you know, consensus driven? Those decisions are made on those teams as they form, and a lot of big projects at Google started out that way. So I'd say there's an example that teams can learn from, right? Which is what's happened at Google and maybe what's happening on their own teams. And then when they make these new teams, like the 20% ones, for example, or the new bets at X or the acquisitions, there's a lot of freedom given to make those calls. And so I think it's kind of an experiment that keeps happening over and over.
Yeah, and we also discussed the accidental versus on purpose nature of the organization within Google. I don't know how much you can say about the way that it's organized, and your observations on how controlled that is versus uncontrolled.
Yeah, I think Google. Trying to think about what I can say. I think Google, last couple of years, they made the switch to be a holding company. I think quite wisely. While I was there, and the sort of reformation that happened because of that was has objectively been good for at least the short-term stock price, right? And starting to compare some of these projects against each other and make some of these calls.
Right.
I think those things happen in cycles, though, right?
Yeah.
And so they're on that cycle of it.
Okay.
Right. I think the culture probably still has this exploratory way, and so if you go through sort of a one cycle of comparing things and choosing which ones are the best ones, you'll go through a growth phase, right? And so I think the inertia is clearly there for it to be a cyclical thing, not like it was doing this and now it's doing that. I definitely wouldn't say that.
Yeah, and there was an observation that you mentioned along the way about how much people want to work for Google as opposed to somebody else.
Yeah, so Google maintains a pretty amazing reputation, at least as a place to work in the world. I always saw it on lists with McKinsey and other consulting companies, and I feel like those are pretty different jobs, which is interesting.
Those rankings are usually done by management consultants.
as someone who does rankings too. So I think it's for what it is. For if you want to be a world-class software engineer, and you want to have some of the the best tools and some of the at your disposal, and obviously lovely places to work and smart people. I think I got a little bit off your question, but the attractiveness to do that I think is quite high. What was the question again?
Well, it's linked to that. I think that because we had a conversation around the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index and how much and whether that leads to retention of people over time or ability to recruit.
Yeah, I think there's everything at Google. So there's enterprise businesses at Google. There's consumer businesses at Google. There with the cloud bet, that's a very different business than the hardware bet.
Yeah. And
one of the things Google has is a lot of ability to move around. I think that's what I was mentioning. And so you might work 2 or 3 years in one role, and then you might change ladders. As I did, I went from a strategy consulting ladder. I'm actually on the engineering ladder now. Okay. I don't know that happens that frequently, but I definitely see people who might go from, say, a sales ladder to a PM ladder, or a program management to product management, or one type of engineering to another type of engineering as they change their skill set. There's one of the things I do as a 20% project is I work on what's called G2G, which is Googler to Googler training. Okay. And we have loads of that. We have an engineering school. If you want to get ML training, there's weeks of training you can go take to start teaching yourself to be an ML engineer. There's Python 101. There's everything you can imagine if you want to spend the effort to train yourself. I mean, it's now with the tools that are available for online training and even in-person training, you can literally change your career while you're at Google, and I've seen a lot of people do that.
And you can start your 20% project from any one of those ladders. You don't have to be on.
Yeah, you can be a salesperson and be the PM on your 20% project.
Right.
Or like me, you can be a strategist on your normal ladder, and you can be a scientist on your on your 20% project.
Yeah, because one of the things that we haven't spoken to anyone yet about is about the rankings that lead to companies being perceived as more innovative, and whether that leads to the ability to attract and retain over time.
Google made a big bet on hiring ML engineers, and that looks to be like it's paying off.
Machine learning.
Machine learning, machine learning. Everything where you teach a computer to label things. That's all ML is. Yeah. So it's saying, I give you a lot of data, and then the computers are very good at saying that is A and that is B. Yeah. Assuming that you have given it enough examples of A and B. Yeah. That is all machine learning is. And Google made a big bet on that because they get a lot of, it's an information technology company. Right. We're categorizing and making available the internet. And so all that tagging, that's kind of the gris of machine learning. And so you have videos on YouTube that are labeled and voice recognition and all these things. These were the data we were taking in, and so not being world-class at ML was pretty obvious, not going to work. And then we happen to have servers. So the other thing that's happened to make machine learning capable these days is something called deep learning, and that's only possible with the compute, the amount of server space, basically, the amount of literally processors to throw at the problem to run these iterative models. And without that, you kind of can't do the kind of machine learning that we do. And so we had both of those things, and then we are where we are. Which is interesting.
And that the ability to understand and deconstruct at the same time is important. And then, clearly within the health space, I know we've spoken a lot about the essential problem of 100-year-old disease definitions still being part of the kind of fabric against which we're developing new drugs and new ideas.
Yeah, I just read the outgoing NCI director's book on cancer, which was, I think, Curing Cancer. Yeah. And it's a labeling problem. Right. And initially when you go into labels, if the label's too general, well, the machine can't learn to label below that, right? Yeah. And so you can't learn on its own. There are machine learning techniques called like clustering and unsupervised learning, and those can begin to do some of that. And Google's not the only person doing this. So unsupervised learning without the gold standard labels with it, and clustering these things out, and then saying, hey, this is a cluster, let's go study that. Yeah. And these were all what we were calling cancer. But it turns out that's childhood lymphoma, and this is sarcoidosis or something, whatever it is, right?
But we're getting that, or we're starting to get towards that in cancer. I think that because partly because it's had a molecular target for such a long time, and people have explored the genetic mutation load and so forth within the tumors. My concern is that you get into areas like mental health that we're still using broad categories like schizophrenia or a major depressive
Now you're getting
disorder.
into my wheelhouse. So the categories, I'm not going to begrudge the people who hammer these things out in committee to make the DSM, right? Like that is exceptionally hard based on what we have, because we don't have data.
Yeah, we've got bad labeling,
we have empirical wisdom, we have research going in lots of different directions, because we just don't know very much. Right? We don't know very much about the brain. We have to admit it. We don't know very much.
Yep. Good start.
And so, and I won't compare, neuroscience to cancer or anything like that, but like taking one of these labels and deconstructing it. And then we have loads of studies. I was doing genetics too, where we say, wait, why does one disease and another disease and another disease that all have radically different labels run in the same family? Right? And are these normal curves and we're just picking out the ends of the curves? Are these bimodal curves under certain environments? Like picking that stuff out, I think computers will be very good. Yeah. But we need more labeling data. Yeah. So the move right now, and there's a lot of folks doing this, is to get passive monitoring, right? And so one interview in a doctor's office is not enough. Yeah. And if you can move towards passive monitoring and like long-range continuous data sets, and folks at Verily are doing that.
Yeah. So. Which starts to feel healthier as a way of, if you take something like schizophrenia, we know there's genetic components, we know that typically socioeconomic components as well, family, environment components, but then also the interventions that we've had are pretty broad brush and pretty poorly measured in terms of their effect. And if you look at the kind of construct that you're describing of an appetite to want to break it down into its, micro subsets.
I mean, it's been variously called personalized medicine, lots of different titles for it. but yeah, subcategorizing disease for neurological and mental health is the next wave, I think.
Right.
And hopefully we'll help destigmatize it.
Yeah. And then you put together what I perceive from the outside as a kind of long bet that someone like Google is prepared to take on. I mean, if you look at, like, you know, mapping the roads and self-driving cars, you think, well, there was no business in that for a long time, right? There's a long time bet. Pharma is, you know, in that same sort of 20, 40 year cycle of, you know, discovery to development to revenue. Do you see any parallels or any differences between the?
Oh yeah, so I mean, I think pharma is interesting because it starts, and at the early stage, if you can kill something, it saves you a lot of money down the road, right? Because the last trials are the most expensive, right? Theoretically. We're at a point which is very different, where we say, let's take in as much data because we don't know what it's going to lead to.
Right.
And that's a very different decision to make at the beginning. So to take the mapping example, let's go out and put cameras on in backpacks and on cars and take in this data. I don't think they knew exactly what product that would turn into. But when I did my interview at Google, they said, you know, what product at Google do you admire? And I said, Maps changes my life every day. Every day I set out with confidence I can get to where I want to go.
Right.
Every day I can take a request from somebody to go meet somewhere I've never been. And I blasely take that request. Hey, come meet Mike at this building you've never been to today. Didn't bat an eyelash, right? Before Maps. Get on the internet, look up where to find it, find a map, whatever it is, right? Like that's a radically different decision multiple times a day. I think when they first sent the cars out, I don't think, you know, there's no way they were foreseeing that everyone would be making different decisions, at least that has the luxury of having Google Maps.
And that's one of the things that we talk a lot about at IDEA, is that exploration and value early. Because you know, one knew where the iPod would lead, you know, in terms of, you know, iPhones and apps and a bunch of other things. And certainly, if you try to do what Pharma tends to do, which is to try to put like 5 decimal place forecasts around a phase 1 asset, you're already limiting.
False precision is.
And how does that get approached at Google? Like, because if do you use those rules of thumb all the way through, or is it some point someone wants to know a number?
So, you know, I don't think I've been there long enough to see things, you know, from genesis to, you know, multi-wave implementation, you know, at scale. So mine would be, you know, snapshots across different projects. The decisioning that happens to kick something off at Google is, I think, more lax, right? So it's experimentation. So it's, you know, if you're really excited about it, well, I believe in you because I hired you, or we hired you, and you're coming to me and saying, I really believe in this. So like your energy is sort of the voting factor for a little while. At the point that you start needing additional resources, then you start to make decisions, right? So then you're making prioritization. So I think then some of the similar sort of let's make a business case for these things pops up, and you say, you know, here's a design brief, here's a PRD, you know, product requirements document, and here's the case at the beginning of the product requirement document. It would be, here's why we need the thing, and here's what the thing has to look like. From the ones I've seen, I don't think they have like, you know, they're not trying to get to multiple decimal places of precision. And that's probably a little bit because of the luxury of resources. But I wouldn't, I think things are allowed to flourish a little bit.
I think that's an interesting word, flourish and thrive. I think because one of the things that that Pharma tries to do is to project 10 years into the future and then bring it back to today with this kind of, you know, huge degree of accuracy, despite us all knowing that it's wrong every time we do it. And projects aren't allowed to flourish, despite all the evidence that most of the great drugs have got where they are through serendipity. You know, they pivoted at some point in their life cycle.
My example for that always is basic research. Is, you know, Carrie Mullis goes and works on, you know, a project which its title would every time get defunded. It's going to go measure proteins and enzymes in what is it? You know, hot geysers, right? No one cares. No one cares about those organisms. But then you get PCR, right? Like his project, as if it came up for a vote, everyone would defund. Right? and then he's driving down the highway and he thinks it up.
Yeah.
You know, like so we have some core principles: more data, better.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
diverse data.
Yeah.
Right. So like try not to just collect data in Silicon Valley. You know, these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Build for scale down the road, because everything we want to do is going to serve, you know, Google's customers, and
Right.
so things probably move more slowly than they would at a startup,
Yeah.
because we're building for scale early.
Yeah.
So those, you know, those are sort of, that can be a headwind of saying, well, go get a bigger data set than maybe a startup would want
Yeah.
to launch their thing,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
build your pipes a little bit stronger
Right.
than a startup might.
So there's some value to there being Google
Right.
there as well.
But then you're slower.
Yeah.
So I mean, those are trade-offs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And probably the last question, because
Yeah.
we could carry on for another few hours, would be just really around, you know, how you personally see health and the kind of intersection
Yes.
of health and Googling, whatever the kind of technology that sits behind that is.
Wow.
Yeah.
So health for me, for Joe Owens, I vacillate between extreme, jaded, skeptical. You know, like I said, we don't know anything about the brain, and
Right.
and we're at that moment of Newton where we can't see Einstein,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
When you're Newton, you can't see Einstein, and so physics, you know, you can't move into relativity. And I feel like we're that moment on the brain at that. But then the same thing, in the same sentence, I have to say there's so much sort of science sitting on the table
Yeah.
that hasn't been brought to people's lives.
Yeah.
From you know, we have doctors that have no time to do the 1,000 things that have been recommended for them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that just sounds like a platform and it's fixing the issues that sort of happen in, like, that's an operations problem. That's a more McKinsey hat problem.
Yeah.
So if we can take all of these recommendations that we have for our health and figure out a way to massage the way we live
Yeah.
to meet them, well, then maybe we don't actually have to know all those things about the brain to actually operationalize some of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think science hat, kind of terrified.
Yeah.
Consulting hat,
Yeah.
I feel like we just need to do some stuff.
So some systems thinking.
And design thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, each of these pieces, like changing the way we live to be healthier.
Yeah.
We sort of know what to do. We just haven't done it.
Yeah. Some of those things are big and thorny if you've got, you know, socioeconomic problems leading to.
But I mean, Google, it changes every day of my life with maps.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It could change every day of my life with my health.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's people who are at Google who are seeing that,
Yeah.
and they're beginning. They have been thinking about it.
Yeah. And actually, the last thing is really around the kind of ethics of that as well, because I'm aware that there's kind of internal ethics,
Yeah.
looking at, you know, whether you can do harm as well as.
Oh yeah,
as
yeah,
good.
yeah. First do no harm is, you know, first of all, medicine.
Yeah.
So if an IT company wants to get into medicine, they gotta follow that.
Yeah.
One of the things we have going right now is a lot of people thinking about machine learning fairness. So
Right.
do you collect diverse data sets?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Things that work on one population won't work on another unless you figure out the little bits.
Yeah.
And so again, that'll be a tax for speed, but it'll be in the effort of fairness, right? And
Yeah.
so and ultimately scale.
Yeah.
So the ethics of that, I mean, I would say you probably don't see people out in the world talking about this, but teams talk about fairness a lot.
Yeah.
Waymo being a great example, right? Like they can't. And the computers are sometimes really good at this. They have an example where there's a woman out in the street shooing a duck with a broom, right? There's no way you were going to train your data set on that, because who could even conceive that the car would ever see that?
Yeah.
And so figuring out ways to handle all these niche cases via getting really diverse data sets and really good transfer learning, like that's it. Computers actually may have a better shot at scale,
Yeah.
or sorry, at fairness. But
Yeah.
we'll see.
No, that's an important thing. Excellent. Well, look, I think if we're on screen, let's go to the widescreen. So I think I promised everyone that this would be phenomenal, and it has been, Joe. And as probably obvious, we could carry on for another couple of hours and debate this. And I hope we get the chance to at some point.
Maybe.
So,
That'd be great.
You know, thank you. And,
Of course. Yeah. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Let's figure out how to turn it off now.